8th, 1983. This is Joe Todd. This is a re-recording of Frances Haskell, recorded by Mrs. Armold. Introduced by Irving Hurst, H-U-R-S-T.
Is the daughter of Oklahoma's first governor. I know some time ago I suggested to a young magazine writer when Oklahoma was observing the 70th anniversary of statehood that Frances Haskell was a vivacious 17 when her father became governor. Now, I'm not going to tell you how old she is, but that was 70 years ago. And I said she was a vivacious 17 then, and she's a spry question mark now. I think you'll find that's at
87 and a half.
When Margaret Bennett asked me if I thought that Miss Haskell would accept the invitation, I said, well, look, ask her. I'm sure she would, but I'm sure she would appreciate the invitation. And so later we were discussing this, and she accepted, and she said, you know, I don't know what to say, but I would be glad to answer questions. Now let me give you a little background so that you will have some basis for asking questions. First of all, one of the things that annoys Frances more than anything is to suggest that at the opening of the Constitutional Convention in Guthrie on November the 20th, 1906, that people came looking like this bunch of Westerners here in Levi's and cowboy boots and things like that. She would have you know that people back in 1906 dressed up, and particularly when they went to the opening of the Constitutional Convention. Let me suggest one other thing, because this might prompt a question later on. You know, it was just 4 days short of a year from the opening of the Constitutional Convention on November 20th, 1906, until statehood on November 16, 1907. Just 4 days short of a year. But now we have statehood, but we've got to set up housekeeping in this new state. And I've often said, as I have peered over the state, that of all the people, of all the men who might have been selected as the first governor, Charlie Haskell was the very best choice the people of Oklahoma could make. In the first place, he was resourceful, he was ingenious, he was dynamic, and Bill Murray, who knew him well, once said he was audacious to the point of being reckless. Let me tell you a little story, because it explains something about the removal of the capital. And if there's anything that annoys me, it is to get up to make an after-dinner speech, and this used to happen 20, 25 years ago, and have somebody come up after the meeting and say, you know, confidentially, it was my pappy or my Uncle John who brought the Great Seal down from Guthrie. And I say, if your pappy or Uncle John wasn't Bill Anthony, he didn't have a damn thing to do with it. And now, Governor Haskell was a little bit more resourceful. I mean, he's a little bit more temperate than I am about that. In 1932, when Oklahoma was observing the 25th anniversary of statehood, I had the good fortune to meet Governor Haskell when he came out to call on Bill Murray one day, when Bill Murray was governor. As usual, Bill Murray was walking and talking. That was before the people had all learned to look to Washington for all the goodies, and so they would flock to the Capitol. And there the governor's office was filled with people waiting to get in, and Bill Murray had a habit that when he got an old-timer in there, he was oblivious to time, and the people would stack up. Well, okay. On this particular morning, I remembered so distinctly as if it were yesterday, this distinguished gentleman came up, and I don't know where McManus was. McManus was Bill Murray's bouncer, about 250-pounder, and he was really a bouncer, all right, but for some reason he wasn't there, and there was a young woman on the desk, and this gentleman goes up and he says, I'm seeing Haskell, and I'd like to see the governor. Well, I think the name didn't register at all on her. In the usual polite way they had Bill Murray's office, she says to him brusquely, well, the governor is busy, go take a seat at the end of the line. There were 2 seats open there, and when I heard the name Cian Haskell, and he chose one, I chose the other, and that's the way we got acquainted. But let me tell you one story that will give you an insight on the removal of the capital. Back in about 1890, and that was about the time that Frances was born, Cian was promoting a railroad in Ohio, and he was having difficulty getting through the town of Ottawa. By the way, that's where he lived. Having difficulty getting right away through the town of Ottawa. So, in a characteristic Haskell fashion, he gets rails and ties and crews together, and he waits until he sees Judge Guard Graham go home at noon on Saturday, and they close the courthouse, and he put the railroad through the town, and when courts opened Monday morning, he was operating trains. 20 years later, in June of 1910, Haskell did exactly the same thing, and the amazing thing to me is that of all the people who get taken, who go overboard to say, it was my daddy or my uncle that brought the Great Seal of State down from Guthrie, and that was a mere instant. They overlooked the fact that CN had the proclamation drawn for a special election on locating the capital, and that proclamation was drawn for the election on June the 14th, which would have been on Tuesday. Now, it was characteristic of him that instead of sending it back to have it retyped, he struck out the 14th and substituted the 11th, changing the election from Tuesday to Saturday, and I researched that quite thoroughly, and apparently nobody took any notice of it. Well, Haskell knew what was going to happen. He knew that Oklahoma City would win it, and he wanted the weekend to wrap things up very neatly, just as he had when he put the railroad through Ottawa. I'll suggest one other thing to you. Miss Haskell had a movie career in the silent movies. She was in France with the ADF, with the American Red Cross. She was later, she lived in Texas. She was co-chairman, Democratic co-chairman for the state of Texas. She wasn't exactly a fan or an admirer of Eleanor Roosevelt, and you'll find her now in the Republican ranks. But she has had a very active career, and of course, the Haskells moved first to Fayetteville. Cian stopped off to visit Muskogee in 1901 after one of the periodic trips to San Antonio to take his family down there for the winter. He was attracted to this vigorous young country and decided to cast his lot with Oklahoma, which was then Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory. But Muskogee was a sort of a pioneer town, so the family located in Fayetteville. And the next time you're in Fayetteville, I want you to see that fine mansion on the hill on the west side of Fayetteville. We visited it last year. It was a beautiful place that Governor Haskell built for his family. He promoted the railroad from Fayetteville to Muskogee. He built the Midland Valley. He built the KONG. He put in a thrift railway system in Muskogee. In fact, it was said of Haskell that he built everything that ran on wheels in Muskogee except the MK&T, and it was already operating when he got there. So the family located at Fayetteville later came to Muskogee. Another thing you might want to ask a question for, because I do see this statute of the symbolic wedding of the territories. In that wedding of the territories on November 16, 1907, a very close friend of the Haskell family, Mrs. Leo Bennett, who was a beautiful matron of Cherokee extraction, and C.G. Jones participated in that symbolic wedding of the territories. Now we go to November 16, 1907, and the vivacious Frances Haskell, and she'll take your questions.
I'll try to stand up for a while anyway.
Okay.
Have any particular question you
I have
want?
a question.
Huh?
I was up to the whatever number of years anniversary of the Guthrie for statehood. I think you were there. And did the original Miss Indian Territory, did she wear that blue hat as she did
Yeah.
for the one last year?
Uh-huh.
The same type of costume.
No, well, it was a hat that the Milner and Guthrie copied from, what was the Barrymore, yeah. It was a hat she wore. It was a maroon colored hat, and it had a long ostrich feather that came down here. Maroon color, and the suit was maroon, and that's what in the daytime. I wish I'd brought the picture of my wedding dress. If you could have seen it, you'd realize why I resent so much in the movies and all around when they show the clothes the people wore at that time. Because this dress you could wear today. It was a dress that was made by our home. We were all born in Ohio. And they made this dress from my mother's inaugural dress. And then I was married 2 years after that, 1910, 3 years. And they made my wedding dress. And both of the dresses had been in the were robes in the St. Louis World's Fair. And this dressmaker in Toledo, Ohio, had gotten these robes. And mine was white lace, and I wish I had because it was princess style, perfectly plain, had these pearls all in here, and was high neck. You don't see many high neck dresses now, but it was. And it had a long train, and it had two slips under it. One was chiffon, and the next one was taffeta. And the dress was white lace, and it was an import from France. But to think of that, they like to picture us as having sunbonnets. I never even owned a sunbonnet. And some silly thing like Kitty and Gunsmoke wears, and we never wore clothes like that. And our clothes were, I know was over here the same in this side, but in Muskogee, the women sent to Bowling Green, Kentucky to Miss Taylor, and she made the dresses, and they were well groomed. I know at the Democratic Convention in 1908, the reporters came in to interview my mother, and she had 4 or 5 ladies with her. And they were beautifully groomed and beautiful gowns, blondes and brunettes. And they, so the reporter said, well, they have Indians down there. And my mother said, yes. And she said, well, do you associate with them? Mother said, well, I don't know. They're very particular. If they'll associate with us, we associate with them. And she said, I think it'd be nice if you'd meet these ladies. Every one of them was an Indian. And Mrs. Bill Thompson of Bonita was a Ross from Tahlequah, the old Ross family. Mrs. Bennett, who was the bride, and different ones, all the different, and they couldn't believe it. These reporters just thought, well, they said, if we go in Indian territory, do we have to carry our sheets and pillow slips? Mother said, well, if you won't carry them out, you do. She said, we always have sheets and pillow slips. But they really believed that they didn't have things like that in Oklahoma. But that was a silly idea they had. But Mother used to laugh when she'd say, well, if they just realized that you take the 2 Porter girls. Mamie's mother, Chief Pleasant Porter of the Creek. He was a Yale man. He wore gray striped trousers, a frock coat, and a silk hat. He was one of the best groomed men in Indian Territory. he graduated in Yale, and he had 2 or 3. I used to go to spend the night with his daughters, and he had a cook and a laundress and a maid, and he had a butler. He had a big 3-story home there in Muskogee. He drove one of those spanking horses, high steppers, and he had a stanhope. And he would go all around, driving around with that silk hat on, and I mean, it didn't look funny because he was so at ease with it. And the Porter girls were both of them went to Ward Belmont, and I went there one year, and then the Turners took a Turner. Her family, her father was a white man. He had that big hardware store over there and supplied hardware all over the Indian Territory. And Tooka went to Monticello. I went there a year too. I wouldn't last more than a year in any school. And I finally got to the University of Arkansas. And then I stayed there. But all these girls had educational backgrounds. They were ladies. They were gentlewomen. And then the idea that they wore sunbonnets and black fascinators and horrible-looking clothes, and they didn't. They really were well-groomed. They'd be well-groomed on Fifth Avenue in New York.
Oh, another thing.
Huh?
Did any women wear
I can't hear.
Did any women wear pants like they did?
Did any women wear pants?
Oh, Lord, no.
They always show them, in breeches.
No,
Well, how were those split skirts
Huh?
made? I've heard about those split skirts.
How are those slit skirts made?
The direct war gown. Sheath gown. You mean that's what you're talking about?
No,
those
those split skirts,
The ones
divide,
when they ride.
where they rode horses. The ones where you see them riding horses.
Divided skirt.
Yes.
Oh, yes, that's what they wore.
How was they made? Was there something
Oh,
like
I had a divided skirt
Was
because
that-
I always had a horse. Huh?
Was that something like, what do we call?
Culottes.
Were there something like culottes that we have today?
They were full. They were as full as a skirt. You couldn't tell how hardly they were divided until you got on the horse. And it just looked like you had the half skirt on each side.
Well, I know my mother talked about it, but I never did see one.
And my mother was a good horse woman, and she wouldn't let me ride my horse till I learned to ride sideways without a saddle. She said, no, you don't get a saddle until you can ride sideways without one. And I learned.
I bet you did.
Where did you live during the governor's term in Oklahoma City?
Well, I was married and lived in Guthrie.
Oh, you lived in Guthrie.
Uh-huh.
Where did
And my husband was a newspaper man over there.
your father live during the term?
Huh?
Where did your father live from?
In the Royal Hotel.
In the Royal Hotel. Where was that located?
That was torn down, I'd say this past year.
Where was it?
Oh, it was on Harrison. You know where that, you remember where they had that bathhouse? Well, that was on Oklahoma. And then there was a vacant place clear through to Harrison. And here was the Royal Hotel and the Royal Theater.
I think her question's in 2 parts. That's when they were in Guthrie where they lived in the Royal. Now her next question is,
In
where did
Oklahoma
you
City,
live
he
in
lived at the
Oklahoma City?
Huckins. And remember at that time, the governor got $4,500 a year,
Yeah.
and if he took a trip, he paid for it. And he didn't get any expenses, and he was allowed a secretary and a stenographer. But then, as he said, you say, well, he ran the state on $2 million a year. I believe it's 200 million now, isn't it? And he built 21 of the 23 state institutions. Started them. Of course, they've added to them, but that's what they had. And he didn't have highways to build and things like that. But I think those legislators got about, what did they get, 2.5 or 3?
No, they got $6 a day.
Not the legislators.
Yeah,
Did they?
after state.
Well, I didn't know they got that much. But anyway, and in Guthrie, that was the thing that really hurt Guthrie. And I'm very fond of Guthrie. And I'll do anything in the world to help them, because I campaigned in spite of the fact that I couldn't vote because women weren't voting then. And so when they had the Capitol campaign, why, they kept the men in Guthrie because they could vote. So the wives went out to different places in the state to campaign for Guthrie. And I went with a Mrs. Finch to Lawton. We had to go there and got there the night before, and the next morning when we got up, we went out and it didn't look very good for us. And so we went out and there were tables outside and they were registering members of the Anti-Horse Thief Association. So we went over and I started talking to them, and I never was one of the silent type. And so I told them what we were there for. And of course, men were very courteous and nice to us. And I still like to have them just that same way. And so this man, they said, well, maybe we can help you. So, sure. So they got out. Well, of course, we lost. But anyway, they all went out and voted against it, but they helped us. And they were mad. And they helped us. But we worked hard for Guthrie. And I'd work hard for Guthrie again.
Tell them about Bill Murray moving his family up there when the first legislature.
Oh, no, that was the Constitutional Convention.
Well, no, when he was Speaker of the House, he moved his family up there for his legislature.
Well, yeah, he moved, he rented a little house that hung on a hill. And they had, it was a 4-room house, no inside plumbing or heating or anything. And somebody said to Bill, well, Mr. Murray, how are you going to manage? There's no water in the house. Well, he says, what do I care? I'm only going to be there 6 months. But Bill was always a good friend of mine. He told me one time if I'd run for office, he'd campaign for me. He said, I never thought, rightly thought, that I would ever campaign for a woman. But you're not what I rightly call a woman.
I met Bill Murray when I was, when he was running for governor. I was just getting into high school. My mother had gone to school to him. So when he came to our town to speak, we went out to the drugstore and she made herself known to him.
I can't hear what
she made herself known to him. We went in the back of the drugstore and sat down. And they reminisced quite a bit. And it was just a different man than anything I heard from him afterwards or before. He looked at me. She told him, introduced me to him. He said, well, say she looks all right, kind of leggy. Oh, yes.
Who was the man?
Bill Murray.
Oh, Bill.
Bill Murray. But he was asking her about different ones. He was all just very, he had met his old pupil. She said he was one of the kindest teachers she ever had. And he taught them manners. There in Texas, it was a new place back in 1892. They'd come in, and a lot of them didn't have silverware and things. They just had to come in wagons and he would set the table and show them how to use a silverware. Now that's a different man than we knew running for as a politician entirely.
Well, Bill Murray was a very fine person.
Oh, yeah.
And Mrs. Murray was a wonderful woman.
And he would go and teach the people to read and write at home, the older people who didn't know how to read and write.
Yeah.
He told them, he said, come to my school.
Yes.
Or if you can't come, he'd go and teach the women at home after school.
Uh-huh. Well, Mrs. Murray, I never forget the night I was on my way from San Antonio to Oklahoma City when my father died. And I got into Oklahoma City. I was on the bus, and that was 33. There wasn't any regular flights, you know. And so Ms. Murray was down to Boston at 2:30 in the morning to meet me. And she never left, and she was with Mother constantly. And so Bill came home that morning, and he said he walked right in the mansion and went right to his room. So Miss Murray heard him, and she told me about that afterwards. And she said, she went up, she always called him Mr. Murray. She said, what's the matter, Mr. Murray? And he said, Haskell died. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'll go over right away. But they were living at Skirvin. And so Bill said, she said, well, you're going over to Muskogee for the funeral, aren't you? And they had his body was in the Blue Room up at the Capitol. And so they went, Bill said, no, I'm not going. So they had somebody that was going to give the funeral, you know, whatever they call it. And anyway, so they had, I've forgotten his name, from Crump, from Muskogee, who'd been a long time friend of his. And Miss Murray, so she got her uncle, Douglas Johnson, the chief of the Chickasaws, and they went over in the governor's car. Well, they had this at the auditorium in Muskogee, and before they could start, here comes a highway patrol car with Bill Murray in it. And he walks over and takes right over. And he really had the most beautiful, he didn't have anything to read it from, he just spoke it. But he used to say, I walked to the Capitol in the legislature, and he'd always say, Mr. Sergeant at Arms, go escort Fluffy Ruffles up here and sit beside me. And he always called me Fluffy Ruffles. But he was quite a character. I think a lot of that he affected, because he was well educated. He knew better, but he liked doing those. And Johnson told me that when they stayed at the hotel there in Guthrie, so Mother would say, well, my older sister, Lucy, she said, why don't you girls go up there and sit with those Murray boys, so Miss Murray can have dinner with, you know, with Mr. Murray. And so I'd do it. Well, of course, Johnson was too old, but Billy was the baby. And I used to kid Billy by taking care of him as a baby. So I grew up with the boys. Well, Johnson was going to be ready to have a party or something. Or at the mansion. And Bill was living with him. And Bill would say, Haskell's daughter coming tonight? And Johnson said, what do you want? Well, of course, I want to call up and tell her to come right over here. And you send over for her. And so I'd go, and finally got it's too much things I didn't want to go to.
you know. And I told Johnson, I said, good Lord, I don't want to go over here and go to every darn thing you have in the mansion. And he said, well, all right. Just let me know and I'll tell the guard, tell her that can't get you, you must be out of town. Guard? Well, he said, I'd call my fellow will come. He said, fine. Well, but Bill was quite a character. Governor Williams came on next. He was a bachelor, and he'd been I like Teddy, and I can start with Washington. We had to learn them. And my daughters, before when they were 5 years old, said every president we used to run races to see how many medals we could turn, and we'd start Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Roe, Adams, Jackson, Harrison, Carter, Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Buchanan, Lincoln, New Orleans. See? We heard the note. And
let's tell them about Grover Cleveland and that little
well, we lived in this little town of Ottawa. All of our family, my brothers and sisters, there were 6 of us, and my mother's family and her sisters and my dad, all of us were born in Putnam County, Ohio. And as a result, we knew everybody in town, and my grandfather had lived drowned out. He came on from Virginia. I think I'll sit down.
Yeah, get kind of. And so he would, we had, my dad was building railroads in Ohio. And the last one he built, he sold to Henry Ford, old Henry, and he's still on it. It goes from Toledo to Lima, Detroit and Lima North. I think they call it the Detroit Building or something now. And he built the Fort Wayne in Weston. And a couple of the railroads. And so he had an office on 24th Street. It's right next to Wall Street. And he shared the office with Abner McKinley, who was President McKinley's brother. And Abner McKinley's wife and daughter lived at the Windsor. And my mother we lived at the middle one up there on 59th and 5th Avenue. She lived about 5 or 6 blocks below that. She always wanted Mother to move to the Windsor. But for some reason, Mother didn't like the Windsor. She said she always had a feeling it was a fire train. So finally, Mrs. Shubley had her daughter Mabel, who had what they call hip joint disease. But one limb was shorter than the other. So Mabel had a long white shepherd's crook. And she was like Margaret Truman. She liked to sing. And being the president's niece, why, she sang. And they'd have her sitting on a chaise longue or something, and then she would, they'd have this, and with this white shepherd's crook. And I used to be so mad that I was a little girl growing up that I didn't have hip joints. Because I wanted a white crook so bad so I could be like she was, you know, with a long crook and with the thing. Well, but we stayed there one time. We went back to our home in Ohio, and 2 weeks later, it burned down, and there were 600 people, I believe it was, burned to death. The McKinleys were out because they were on the first floor. They could step right out the window. And so I was like this, and that's when I knew President too. So I knew him, and they lived in Ohio too. In fact, about that time, all the president's husbands came from Ohio or Virginia.
I want Grover Cleveland was coming.
No, they're just clapping for something in there.
Yeah, there's a meeting in there.
When Grover Cleveland was coming to visit,
Oh,
you know, you were a
and
little
so
girl.
when Grover Cleveland was coming there, Mother was having a bridge. Every time that any president would come to Ottawa, why, they'd done my dad because we had a 23-room home and they had good servants, and we had 2 bathrooms, running water, and a telephone. And there was just 2 other houses that had a bathroom and a home. So whether it was a Democrat or Republican, they'd come and say, hey, listen, President Harrison's going to be here tonight. Can we, in no hotels, and there were no trains. They couldn't stop and go through, you know, and they had to stay all night. So they'd say, can we put them up at your house? And my dad said, oh, sure. So they'd come. That's how I happened to know them. And so then, when Grover Cleveland was coming, he was a bachelor. And he had an illegitimate child. And so Mother was having a party the afternoon before he got there. Some kind of cards, I don't know what they played in those days, because I never did like cards. And so anyway, all her friends were there. And here we kids were out playing in the yard. And so all of a sudden, we took a notion to go in the house, and somebody had told us this song. So here we come with our hand on the shoulder of the kid in front of us, at the top of our voice singing, Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. And Mother grabbed me, somebody grabbed my brother, my sister escaped because we were leading her astray, and the other mothers grabbed their kids, and we really had the brush on it. But that was what happened on those. And then, let's see, McKinley, I knew him, and then Teddy Roosevelt, and then I knew him up there in New York. Well,
I think Taft would be after Roosevelt.
Huh?
Taft was after Roosevelt, wasn't he?
yeah.
Yeah.
And Taft came down to Guthrie during the time, he was in part of the time my father's administration. And he weighed about 300 odd pounds, and they didn't have a bathtub big enough for him to get in, so they had to send to St. Louis and get one. I don't think they ever used it afterwards because it's so darn big. And they still had to take a room and put the bathtub in a special bedroom for Taft. And then it was, let's see, Taft.
Wilson.
Huh?
Wilson.
Yeah. Oh, I knew Wilson up there. And of course, in those days, I was overseas, and I saw him over there, and then I saw a lot of him in Washington. And that was when the AEF was singing, instead of singing God Save the King, knowing Wilson's reputation, they were saying God Save the Queen. And I remember the AEF was having a lot of fun singing God Save the Queen. So, and we had a lot of Oklahoma boys. I used to, every time they'd bring in a new shipment in the hospital I was in, I would go to the ambulance a while, and then I was in the University of Virginia unit at Saint Denis, out of Paris. I was there in at the armistice time. But before that, I was up between Toole and Nancy in the Richmond unit. And then I was in the California unit down between Vichy and Nevers. And at San Denis was the University of Virginia. And but every time they bring in a bunch of soldiers, I'd say, any Oklahoman. So they got to call me Miss Oklahoma. And everyone, they'd all line up as soon as I'd say it. And I remember one time this boy, they brought in a Negro boy, and they brought him in, and he was very bad, and he was scared to death, and he was pretty young. And so I'd say he was still in his teens. And so he was scared. So I went over to him, and I thought, well, I'd talk to him. So I said, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Oklahoma. And I said, I'm from Oklahoma. Well, he perked right up. And I said, well, whereabouts in Oklahoma were you from? He says, Taft, Oklahoma. And I said, oh, I was from Muskogee. And he said, then he says, I sure respect your father. He let all my folks hang.
You did what?
No, but that's the one you remember. But he said, I sure have a lot of respect for him. Anyway, then let's see, who was Wilson, and then was Harding, and Mrs. Harding roomed with a cousin of my mother, Jenny Beatty. And so when she wanted to, Mrs. Harding's father wanted her to, this cousin of mother's, to marry him. And she wouldn't marry him because Mrs. Harding had married Harding, who was a newspaper man in Marion, Ohio, and he had disowned his daughter when she married him, and he never did. And so this cousin of mine, who, to defend her roommate, said, I won't marry you unless you forgive this, whatever, I've forgotten her name, Mrs. Harding. And so she said, so he finally did, but he would never let Harding come in the house. He didn't like Harding's ancestors. And he would never let him come in the house. And let's see, then Harding and Coolidge. I knew every one of these except as I say those two. And Coolidge was a quiet little man, and Mrs. Coolidge was a very charming lady.
Grace.
And then let's see, who was next?
Roosevelt. No, Hoover.
Yes. And I first met her Hoover I was a widow then, and I met her at a house party, Everly Davis of Park Davis Chemicals, you know, and he was a widower, and he was giving me kind of a rush, and he and Hoover had gone to, what's that school in California, University at...
San Francisco, Legal Center.
And so he was on this house party at his home, his country home. And I was there for a couple of weekends, different times. He had Warren Raff, the singer, and Sally James Farnham, the sculptress, and all that bunch, you know, was there. And and Hoover was there, but she wasn't there. I never met her. And then Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and McAdoo and my dad were supposed to get they were supposed to go at a Boy Scout Jubilee. I think they have them at Bear Mountain every year. And they were supposed to speak at this Jubilee. Well, my dad and McAdoo were there, but Roosevelt sent word that they sent word for him that he had infantile paralysis and wouldn't be able to come. So there he, after that, then he wrote my dad a letter and said that he was very lonesome, and would my father manage to come up to see him up at Hyde Park as often as he could. So he'd go up there, and of course with Roosevelt, you know, you listened, you didn't talk. he never stopped talking. He just went on like a machine. And so Roosevelt, so then when Roosevelt was nominated in Chicago, my dad was a delegate for Oklahoma, and I was a delegate from Texas. And we had connecting rooms, and all the old-time people, you know, that Al Smith and all that bunch were up with my dad all the time, and so we just back and forth. And so that night, we were boosting John Garner. I don't know why, but we were. And he never carried Uvalde County in the 40 years he's in Congress. And Archie Parr was his best campaign manager. But he, anyway, he ran. We were backing him. And so when we were going home on the train, I said, do you want to wait and see Roosevelt when he comes in? He says, oh, heavens, no. He said, I've seen him enough. And so we went on back, and it was one of those parlor cars. And, you know, you whirl the seats around that way. And he's sitting with his head on his hand this way, and I said, Sin, he died a year later, and I said, Sin, don't you feel good? Yes, but I never thought I'd live to see the day I hoped the Democratic nominee would be defeated. And I said, how come? He said he will join minorities. He will cause discontent. He'll start this country in an upset that we'll never get over. He said he will run. He'll have everything. The bureaus will run everything. Oh, he went on and told everything. And I said, well, CN, I said, if he is elected another term, I said, I said, he couldn't get all that done. And my father said, don't worry about the terms. Once he gets in, only God Almighty will take him out, and he'll stay there till the day he dies. And says if he can do it, he'll have what's that first son's name? Elliot. He'll have him in following. And he never did much.
He was right, wasn't he?
Yeah. We've had everything. He says he'll cause discontent in minorities. He'll do everything. And so that was it. And then when I was chairman down in Texas, why, I spent a lot of time going back and forth, and between San Antonio and New York. Well, I knew what Garner was. So, but the second time they went around, when Garner wasn't running, why then I heard say, I was still a loyal Democrat. So I went back then. Casey Blackburn was head of one of Roosevelt's Gestapos. And I mean, it was a Gestapo, don't fool yourself. And so then they had this, Casey called me up and she said, you're going back to Texas for a trip. I was going back and forth. And she said, I'll tell you what I wish you'd do. I wish you'd stop every 50 miles. Pick out a place where there's several people, at least 10 congregating. The people. And mention Roosevelt's name and see what they say about it. If anybody says a word against him, find out who that person is. And every night send me a list of names and their address. So I did that. Well, I thought they were just one of the campaign lists. I mean, I was just stupid. So I sent them back to them. I've got letters I found the other day thanking me for my list from Casey herself. And the office of the president was in the White House, this bureau. It says, Office of the President, Office of Government Reports. That was government reports. And so after I made 3 trips, that was 6, one way and the other. I said, Casey, what in the world do you want all this silly information for? And she said, why, we have to know what the people think. Well, I said, that's just like Russia to me. I don't like that. I don't want any part of it. And so she said, I said, well, why did you pick on me? And she said, oh, you have a wonderful record. I have the New York Times that says you were the snag in the Garner setup. I said, well, that wasn't because I liked Roosevelt. I said, it's because I knew Garner. So she said, she went on and brought me clippings of things. They had a clipping book. I put the clippings that high in a box. One of these boxes you put the top over, showing what a good record I had. Yes. And so then I had the dubious honor of having to escort Eleanor around. And every time she'd come to Texas, I'd have to meet her at the border and ride with her. And Roosevelt would come down with Marguerite LaHand, and I'd have to go chasing around with her. And with him. Only they'd have a private train. And when Roosevelt would shake your hand, his hand was fat and soft, and he was just like sticking in the dough before you cook, when you chewy that way. Awful. So, anyway, Eleanor came down there, and it happened to be the next day was her wedding anniversary. Well, all day long in the St. Anthony Hotel, we waited to hear from Franklin, but Franklin, to this day, never heard. She thought he was going to send her a message. And so Eleanor told me that she had a young boy living in the White House who was 16 years old, and he had a remarkable mind. He has visions at night and then tells her about them in the morning. This one vision just struck her. And they had the nerve. I thought they were trying to bring it up again last year. Some of that fuzzy bunch. Yeah. And she said, when a child is born, it should be taken immediately away from its parents, because the Americans aren't qualified to rear their children. I thought, well, oh, there you are. And she said, and then kept for 10 years, and by that time, she said, they will, they'll be weaned away from their parents. They will have no feeling for them.
Who said that, Miss Haskell?
Eleanor.
Oh, she said it.
Oh, yes. And so I said, well, I wouldn't have anything to do with that. That is communism. I don't like anything about that. Oh, my dear, you don't understand. American people, parents they can't rear their children. They don't know how. It's for the next generation that we need. We're looking for them. So that, by the time I got back, I was a Republican.
You're wonderful.
And I had the honor this year to be your Republican chairman of your Republican Electoral Committee. Yes, I had to vote for Ford, but my heart belonged to Reagan.
Oh, Miss Haskell, we just can't thank you enough. It was